Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. Just over 41 years ago, there was a famous incident on the New York subway system. A vigilante called Bernard Goetz shot four black teenagers. It turned into all sorts of political cause célèbres. And ironically enough, there are two major books out about the shooting in 1984. This month at the end of January. Firstly, my guest today is Heather Ann Thompson, who has a new book out. She is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, one of America's most distinguished historians. Her new book is called Fear and Fury, the Reagan 80s, the Bernie Goetz shootings, and the rebirth of white rage. And as it happens, there's another book out by somebody called Elliot Williams, who's going to appear on the show in a few days, called Five Bullets, the story of Bernie Goetz, New York's explosive 80s, and the subway vigilante trial that divided the nation. We're going to get Elliot Williams on the show later, but today we have Heather Ann Thompson. Heather, what's the occasion for two new books, let alone one, two new books by major historians on Bernie Goetz? Is it just coincidental, or is there a special kind of anniversary, or is it symbolic of our age of Trump and MAGA?
I think it's very symbolic of the moment we're in. I mean, it's really interesting. I don't think that Elliot Williams nor myself knew about each other, busily researching these respective books. And I think we came to them probably for similar reasons, which is we're just trying to figure out what in the world happened in this country that all of a sudden we have given really a carte blanche to utter rage and violence and vigilantism, and without apology and also with legal sanction. And I think this is, I'm a historian, he's a legal scholar. I think both of us come at it probably from very different angles, but nevertheless, we're perplexed, I think, by the same phenomenon, which is, how in the world did we get to this moment where, someone like, Kyle Rittenhouse can gun down people and be vindicated, or, going way back, someone like George Zimmerman can kill Trayvon Martin without consequence. And there's just kind of something in the air and the water that really culminates with January 6th that we're trying to figure out.
We've all seen, of course, Mean Streets, and then Taxi Driver, the 1976 masterpiece by Martin Scorsese about a different kind of vigilantism in New York City. How surprising would the people have been in the 80s to what happened on the New York subway? Were they as surprised as you're suggesting, or did they look back to the 60s or 50s or other periods in American history to make sense of it?
Well, I mean, I think one of the most remarkable things about this moment that I'm trying to figure out is, it actually is quite a break. There is a real optimism in the United States that the rule of law matters. In fact, so much so that there's a real clamoring for law and order even towards the ends of the 1960s. And yet something is gone so off the rails by the 80s that at least some in the American population do not feel that the government will take care of public safety. They won't take care of basic needs in major cities. And so it's on them to implement public safety themselves, to kind of reject government. And that's a surprise, because certainly coming out of the Great Depression in this country, people were quite, moved and benefited mightily from kind of the explosion of a social safety net in this country. So something happens really towards the end of the 70s, and we take such an extraordinary detour. And that moment is the Reagan 80s. So sure, by the time Bernie Goetz actually pulls the trigger, Are people surprised? Maybe not, but they're really divided over whether that's the way to go or whether this is a terribly slippery slope that we are on as a nation. And it turns out that we really were.
Yeah, this idea of a slippery slope, you're suggesting that America was fine during the New Deal and then Reagan came along and ruined everything and it resulted in Bernie Goetz. Isn't it possible just that he was a psychopath and that he did something terribly wrong, but it doesn't necessarily reflect on Reagan or neoliberalism or the response to the New Deal? I mean, you had Thatcherism in the UK, you had all sorts of other responses to social safety nets around the world, but Bernie Goetz, I don't remember there being an incident on the London Underground with Bernie Goetz-like vigilante. So could it just be accidental, or is there some inevitable narrative of history, at least in your mind and in your new book?
Well, I mean, I don't think that, of course, I don't believe anything in history is inevitable, and nor is it all tied to the actions of one person. But what is really striking is that the United States does take a pretty dramatic turn with the election of Reagan. And what that turn is quite interesting, that I think that the Goetz story really exemplifies. For starters, one of the things that happens on the way to electing Reagan is this argument that government is broken, that the liberal state can't provide for anyone anymore. And so the solution is we just starve that state. We offer tax breaks upward, and that the idea is it will trickle down and benefit everybody. But on the ground, the way to sell that is really complicated because, trash is piling up in the city services are atrophying, and certainly if you're poor, you're really experiencing the trauma of that. But for someone like Bernie Goetz, he is interpreting the kind of collapse of the city of New York, and many like him were, as the fault of Blacks, the fault of poor people, the fault of all kinds of people, except for the people that were really stripping the social safety net, that were making these things much, much worse. That was not by accident. It turns out that was deeply curated. That was curated by, in effect, a misinformation media that just kind of is getting started. And also from the top down, it's really getting curated from the Reagan administration. I mean, in my book, I have some really interesting, evidence that within the Reagan administration, they fully understand that in order to get the tax breaks that rich people have long wanted, the way to do that is through effectively encouraging, racial fear and really stoking the flames of racial fear. So Bernie Goetz is really he's kind of ground zero of that, whether he knows it or not. So he's symbolic. He's not driving it, but he's really symbolic. So his event really captures the imagination of a lot of other people, and thus his celebrity. He is the, death wish vigilante on the ground that people are really celebrating, and thus they completely erase the kids that he shoots. So there's this complete inversion, right, of victim and villain, which I think we really need to take a moment and look at, because today that inversion is almost complete. The Reagan Revolution is almost complete, right? The greed is good, austerity. Here we are. This is the final chapter of that.
Yeah, we've heard final chapters before, Heather, and never the final chapter. Yeah, I have to admit, I don't find this. I mean, you've obviously done enormous research for this. It's not for me to say whether or not it's convincing. But are you suggesting that there was some sort of conspiracy on the part of the Reagan administration to create types like Bernie Goetz who go out and go crazy and start shooting innocent people?
No, not at all. And in fact, I mean, history doesn't work that way. It doesn't work as conspiracy. It doesn't work as someone, pulling the strings behind the scenes. But there are a series of political and policy decisions that people want to see implemented for very self-interested and for them very logical reasons. So, for example, for Republicans, particularly very wealthy Republicans, there had long been this really concerted effort to kind of undo a lot of the New Deal, undo the welfare state to the extent the United States had one, which of course was comparatively small. but nevertheless to undo it. And they recoiled from the beginning at a tax structure that resembled what FDR puts in place. And there's a long process that we get to Reagan. But the thing that's really striking about Reagan is that, unlike even Nixon, who was still kind of playing ball with that liberal accord, even though he was moving the needle rightward, the Reagan Republicans call it a revolution for a reason. They want to do this very, very differently. But, of course, many of their voters who are, disenchanted with the civil rights movement, and they're disenchanted with a lot of the things that are going on in the cities, they also don't think that rich people should get tax breaks. They also believe that there should be a social safety net. So they understood that they had to kind of square that circle, and squaring that circle by essentially saying that the problems you face are because of the black underclass. The problems you face are all these people that just can't seem to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And we see that over time this gets doubled down on by particularly the media as very potent inflammatory rhetoric. And indeed, Rupert Murdoch's Fox News comes out of this moment because the New York Post, his paper, is what kind of seizes on to the Bernie Goetz folk hero. He is the guy that that really exemplifies this moment, but not because Reagan plants him or even encourages it per se, but rather it's a political moment, much like we're in a political moment now. And there are always people that reflect the playing out of those political moments.
Yeah, it sounds like you're rejecting the idea of sort of treating history as a kind of conspiracy, but you're suggesting that Murdoch, and I know you write extensively about the birth of Fox News in your
Mm-hmm.
book, which reflects the same time period. It seems as if, in your mind at least, or in your narrative, history has a certain kind of logic. It's not haphazard, it's not sporadic, it's not accidental.
Well, I mean, it's definitely true that no matter what period in history you choose, you have all kinds of different people at, always vying for different visions of a government, different visions of what they think will be best, both for themselves, but sometimes also for the common good. And these ideals are always warring with one another, were from the very beginning of the founding of the nation. And race has always been really a wedge issue that has allowed that to go either rightward or leftward, depending on the moment. But what is pretty, I think, agreed upon, frankly, by historians is that, we come out of the Great Depression, which incidentally was previously an era of Jim Crow racial violence and lawlessness and lynching and really no social safety net. And for 50 years, we kind of embrace a different kind of social accord. And it doesn't matter whether it's Nixon in the White House or Eisenhower, or who it is, there is an understanding that the government at some level has a responsibility to the social safety net. Always was discriminatory for sure, but something changes pretty dramatically with Reagan. And notably, by the way, this is not all hung on Reagan, because after the Reagan Revolution, every subsequent president, namely Bill Clinton, doubles down on that new Reagan agenda. In fact, the only real break from that is the Obama years, which then, of course, we pick right back up where we were with the rejection of that.
What about the role of the American people? I mean, there were populist risings of one kind or another, both on the left and the right, the hard-hatted rebellion against certain kind of permissiveness in New York City, where you are right now. Mm-hmm. Are you suggesting that somehow is orchestrated, that it wasn't real?
Which a populist sentiment to
a pushback, for example, to one kind of permissiveness or another, conservative reaction to the 1960s. I mean, we're talking about a period before the 80s. In the 1960s was also, in a very complicated way, a very violent and traumatic period. Can one argue, Heather, that that there was a popular. I mean, you talk in your book. The subtitle is "The Rebirth of White Rage," but could one also suggest that it's a populist white anger against what's happening in America that isn't just bound up in Reagan and the free market? It's a reactionary vision of what America should be, and in that sense, whether you like it or not, it's legitimate.
Oh, I mean, there's no question. I think, if the through the very lengthy pages of the book, I think that you'll see it's a very much a moment born of real sentiment that was coming out of the decades of the 60s and 70s, and particularly coming out of the economic dislocations of the 70s, but also, and I make this really clear, coming out of the racial dislocations of the 60s. One of the reasons why race becomes such an important wedge in the liberal coalition, frankly, that is so effective in undoing that coalition, is because, of course, people feel that they have long had privileges that they are now being expected by law to share, and certainly by popular mandate to share. So everything from public education to continuing to fund, for example, public housing when white people disproportionately benefited from the New Deal, and many of them did not even see why we were still funding, for example, housing projects in the South Bronx. The question then becomes, in these moments of dislocation, how is that narrated, right? How is that sold in political rhetoric as we go into elections and so forth? And this is where we really turn the corner. And that doesn't mean it's not legitimate. It's absolutely populist. It's absolutely born out of a moment, much like right now in New York City. The Mamdani movement is exactly the same thing. It's a reaction to all those decades of austerity, and greed is good, and gentrification, and this idea that we're going to save the country by saving the rich wears thin, as well as is very, very powerful.
We did a show last year. I'm sure you're familiar with John Gantz's new book. Well, it was a new book, When the Clock Broke, about how a lot of this reactionary white anger erupted in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what your take is on his thesis. I mean, it could be, I guess, seen as the next chapter in your book. But is there a clear narrative, a lineage between what happened with Goetz and today in 2020's America when it comes to
Absolutely.
What you call white rage?
Yes, and so that's really, as we started the program, that's what interested me in it. I mean, I think that history is, deeply instructive to the present always, and the question is, in what ways is it linear, and what ways is it contested? And certainly my own book, while it is centered on this dramatic moment on this one subway car, and how this plays out in the courts, and how this plays out really on the ground and also nationally. While that's the core of the book, the core is a deeply political history. So we absolutely go into the 90s and really talk about what does it mean as we then take that Reagan Revolution on the ground into different decades. So Giuliani is a key figure in his rise to power, and certainly his complete remaking of New York in that image of austerity, but definitely moving the needle upward in terms of protecting a certain class. And we go all the way up to Trump. I mean, trying to explain, right, how do we get this absolute unleashing of white rage? And the reason why the Bernie Goetz case is actually not incidental to that is when you have juries that effectively start to say it is okay to completely take the law in your hands, and that gets codified in law and in the courts and moves forward and forward, we then should not wake up surprised in the political moment that we're in right now, right? Where the rule of law is utterly just the noses are thumbed to the rule of law today. And we need to understand that, because that is not necessarily a given in this country.
Are you suggesting then that the Goetz case legitimized vigilantism?
I mean, in a lot of key ways it did, which is one of the reasons why a very recent case in New York just a few years ago was another subway killing of a homeless man on the New York subway system. And immediately everyone invokes Goetz. And when Kyle Rittenhouse goes to trial, people invoke Goetz, because in part people are sort of saying, look, he was a hero then, men like that are heroes now. And they need to be supported in law. So if you actually look at what happens to law, the stand your ground moment is directly tied to cases like Bernie Goetz. The National Rifle Association is so interested in the Bernie Goetz case, actually helps to fund his defense, his first defense in the criminal trial, and then helps to fund him again when he's being sued civilly by one of his victims. And that's because they understand this is a moment. They can come into a liberal city like New York and bring the NRA agenda northward. And they're very open about that. So one of the things about being a historian is you just get to go into the documents and look at what people were actually saying and doing. One doesn't have to rewrite history backward. We just start back at the beginning and kind of say, well, what were people saying at the time? The National Rifle Association, Rupert Murdoch, Rudy Giuliani. I mean, they're all very clear, actually.
Do you see, I mean, Murdoch and Giuliani, and obviously we talk too much about Trump, but he's obviously implicated here as being directly guilty for this? And they knew what they were doing?
Guilty for what?
Well, for the bloodshed.
They certainly do not pull the trigger on that subway train, but they absolutely end up defending him. And in fact, Rudy Giuliani is the state's attorney general. He is going to be the guy that when the civil rights community is appalled that there's nothing really happening, they want a civil rights case filed, and he ultimately decides not to do that. He will bring more law enforcement, again, the buildup of prisons, the buildup of policing, all of this is part of that same moment. And stand your ground and changes in law like that also come out of this moment. So, did Giuliani say, yes, I'm glad Bernie Goetz pulled the trigger? No, he didn't, but plenty of his supporters did, particularly in Queens, white working class suburbs. And Goetz gets invoked again and again and again, particularly in the conservative talk media.
You're obviously an American, Heather. Do you write with disappointment, anger? You're clearly deeply disturbed with this narrative, this shift from what you call the New Deal to the rebirth of white rage through the 90s up until Trump. Is your sense of disappointment in the American nation? Clearly, there's a significant, if not majority, certainly minority of people who support this through Goetz up to Trump. What's your emotion as you write this book? Is it of anger, of disappointment as an American?
I mean, I think it's all of those things, but because I also am a historian, I also write always with a measure of optimism, because one of the things about this nation, as all nations, you mentioned the UK, ordinary people are not easy to peg, and people who are at the top with the most money and the most power have to work pretty hard to hold on to such disproportionate wealth and disproportionate power. So at the end of the book, I think I end on some measure of hope and optimism, but of course it is disappointing to really get into the weeds. In my book, you get to know these kids who he shot that get completely erased in this story. You go into their homes, you go into the hospitals where they are fighting for their lives. And it is really extraordinary to then read, for example, as I did, go in the archives, in the lawyers' papers, reading the hate mail It was just, they were drowning in hate mail, just vile, vile, vile racist hate mail from ordinary citizens all over the country. And that's disappointing, right? It's
Well, to put it
disappointing.
mildly, I think I
Yeah,
think we
I
could probably
mean,
think of some stronger
exactly.
words than
Yeah,
disappointing.
that's right. It is infuriating. It is so disappointing, though, that we as a nation have enough to go around. We have enough to imagine more justice and actually live up to ideals that we hold dear. And yet, time and again, uh, self-interest, particularly among really wealthy people at the very top, how are you going to get your taxes? How are you not going to pay for the public good and be able to keep that for yourself? Has had really serious consequences, just like it did in the Gilded Age. It does again after the Reagan 80s and kind of becomes more and more so as that period goes on. So sure, it's in any country that experiences that, any country with this measure of wealth and opportunity that chooses to stoke flames of racism and outrage and to justify lawlessness in the name of order, it's alarming, actually.
Heather, though, wouldn't it be fair to say that particularly in the 2020s in America, the coastal states, both East and West Coast states, New York, California, tend to be wealthier, tend to be actually rather critical of a lot of this. You're in New York right now, certainly one of the wealthiest states, New York City being the wealthiest city in the country. I'm in San Francisco, another very wealthy city, Los Angeles, which tend to be very critical of Trump, of MAGA, whereas the much of their core support is amongst certainly poorer white communities. You keep on making this connection between greed and racism and white rage, but are they as intimately connected as you're suggesting? Really, I'm not suggesting that all. Are you somehow suggesting that wealthy people use white rage to pursue their own interests, and there's some sort of conspiracy of wealthy Americans to use white rage to pursue their own interests economically?
I think that white rage is a very, very potent tool and always has been in American history to destabilize a political agenda that is more broad-based. It's one of the reasons why, going way back into labor history, that the way you stop unionization is you bring in black strike breakers who then are scads. You divide that group of people from one another. I mean, there is absolutely, irrefutable and deep history in this country of people stoking the flames of white racial prejudice, fear, resentment. But I do think that you make a really important point that I also hope comes out in the book, because I believe it and I hope to make it really strongly, which is that those places that are the poorest, that end up voting for this, that end up trying to support things that are actually incredibly bad for the places where they live. So supporting policies that, for example, make it impossible then later for you to send your own children to college, or to have good public schools, or to have support when you lose your job in terms of decent aid, ultimately, but even, workman's compensation, you name it. We have to understand why people would be so willing to give those things up in favor of this idea, right, that they're going to get something else that's really potent. And that potency is being on top, not having immigrants hoard our country, or, rush our country, not having undeserving people on aid, even if that means I can't get aid myself if I need it. This is a really interesting phenomenon. And so in a place like New York, that is incredibly wealthy, it also has a whole lot of people that have suffered the Reagan 80s onward. I mean, this is one of the most policed, one of the most imprisoned populations in the entire country. This is true in San Francisco, the policing, the rise in homelessness, the police. People are also really fed up. And this is why we get Mamdani. And this is why, for example, you got one of the most progressive prosecutors for a long time, because people were rebelling up from that. So it's always contested. And I think that's super, super interesting. And I think the Goetz story is a way, it's a narrative way we can kind of grab hold of it and we can better understand it, I think.
Although, again, coming back to my question, I mean, wealthy people don't always vote in their own interest, just as poor people don't vote in their own interest. I mean, history is more complicated than simply economic self-interest, isn't it?
That is true. And in the book, the best example I give of that actually is the Obama years, and the way in which there is a reaching into a different kind of accord, an older kind of accord, where particularly liberals and wealthy liberals could feel very, very good again about wresting back their country from the agenda of austerity. But interestingly, again, because of those years, what comes afterwards is even more virulent, even more driven by a politics that is anti-immigrant and anti-Black and really anti-poor. And so this is, I hope it's such a complicated history, it's really hard to kind of redo it all here, but absolutely, people do vote against their class interests across the spectrum. And what's interesting is why people are being pulled, the leaders are pulled as they are.
How does Reagan come out of your narrative? Of course, he himself was the victim of an assassination attempt. There are many mainstream Republicans or former mainstream Republicans who are nostalgic for Reagan and view him as very different from Trump. Is your narrative that Trump is really just the next chapter in the Reagan story?
Well, I mean, the phrase I have often used is it's a really doubling down on the agenda. I mean, Reagan is still enough tethered to that different era where there is still a social safety net. There is still an idea that the government has some utility for the broader public, but it does really get eroded during his administration quite actively, quite deliberately, and that's not conspiracy. It's just spending many, many hours in the Reagan papers and looking at the internal discussions, for example, why they want to make sure they court Rupert Murdoch, because Murdoch has a way of translating the Reagan agenda that they find very, very helpful. And why not the New York Times? Because they don't want a liberal take on what they're trying to do, because of course it's trying to undo that agenda. So it's still laying the groundwork, but it's not realized. I mean, as much as Reagan even starts to undo the tax structure and change things, and as much as the 80s becomes ground zero for some of the worst racial, white on Black racial violence, I mean, you can imagine, across the country, we see this from Howard B. We just go on and on. As much as that's true, what is notable is how every subsequent administration, both federally and on the ground locally, just takes as a given, government is bad, liberalism is bad, social spending is bad, and cutting taxes is good. And so the tax structure just gets more and more and more concentrated, so that wealth concentration is it's the reason we have some of the worst income inequality today that resembles the Gilded Age once more.
So to end, Heather, it sounds to me as if you're somewhat of a conservative, at least with a small c. The narrative in the book is things used to be all right in America. There used to be a social safety net. There was a New Deal. There was a great society. Then it all went wrong in the 80s. And in a way, you're nostalgic for a lost past in America. Is that fair?
Well, I'm certainly nostalgic for the moment when we understood that the nation as a whole is constituted by many, many people who all cannot reach the brass ring. And so we have to have an apparatus that makes up for the fact that the economy waxes and wanes, makes up for the fact that people who are disabled will need care, makes up for the fact that people need education and that not everyone can afford the same education. The turn to that understanding, I do have a nostalgia that has been badmouthed and relegated to somehow the ashbin of failure, when in fact we had the lowest, for example, child poverty rate in that period. We had more people going to college. We had more Black teenagers going to, good schools and going to college. Like, I miss that. And I think it's important that we realize that that wasn't a failure, that we deliberately went down a path that called it a failure rather than figuring out how to make that better, for sure.
Well, there we have it. One of America's leading historians, perhaps not surprisingly, nostalgic for the past. Her new book, Fear and Fury, the Reagan 80s, the Bernie Goetz shooting and the rebirth of white rage. Very, very important book, not just to understand the 1980s, but the 40 years since. Heather, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. And I think it will probably turn out to be just as successful as your last book that won the Pulitzer Prize. Thank you so much.
Well, good discussions, I hope, will come like this one. Thank you so much.